Welcome to MABA. The weather's pretty warm today, but it's nice. It's not hot yet, so we'll get at least one day of nice spring weather this year. So our schedule has changed this year somewhat. Instead of having Dharma talks every week, as most of you know, we're now only going to have them about 2 times a month. The first Sunday and the third Sunday of the month. This is to give us some more time to prepare for the academy that we're going to open in the fall. So this spring, Master Jiru asked us to give talks on the Western regions. I'll get into more detail on what that means, but for now just know that it's areas west of China, Central Asia in particular. It's a really big area, and most Americans don't know very much about it. I was rather excited when Master Ji asked us to teach on this because this was one of the areas I studied in college. I majored in Middle Eastern history, and I was able to include Central Asia in this. I did not really study Buddhism, though. When I studied this in college, I was focused more on other aspects of history. Some of the areas I focused on and wrote papers on were epistemology, which is the study of how people know things. How do we know what we know? How do we decide that something's true? And how is our mind and our view of things shaped by our surroundings, our culture, our environment, our religion, technology we grew up with? Another area I was very interested in was a comparison of nomadic peoples and urban or settled peoples. And these are some things that are really interesting in the Western regions. So I hope I can bring those to bear some fruit today in my talk. These Western regions are important for Buddhism because they're the main way that Buddhism came to China. In this first slide, you can see Buddhism coming to China. The gentleman to your left with the red hair and the blue eyes is probably a Sogdian. He's a monastic who is teaching. You can tell this because he has his hand in this mudra. This is a teaching mudra. The gentleman on the right is a Chinese monastic who's coming to hear a teaching, and he's greeting the teacher and listening to him with reverence. So, first we need to know what the Western regions are. Now this is a Chinese term for this area because it's to the west of China. In Europe and America, we usually call these areas Central Asia, or we often in the past referred to them as the East because they're east of Europe. To China, they're the West, so they're called the Western regions. When it's used in a general sense, the Western regions can mean anything west of China, Central Asia, Middle East, even India. On this map, I placed a star approximately where the Jade Gate was. Today it's in ruins. But around the 2nd century BC, this was a thriving and important place. You may not have heard of the Jade Gate, but you've probably heard of the Great Wall of China, which of course is not just one wall, it's a lot of walls. And they're not just to the north. Those are the famous ones where you can take tours and go visit them. There are also walls to the west. And when you have a wall, you have to have a way to get through it. One of these was called the Jade Gate. These regions are important because the Silk Road went through them, which allowed trade from China to branch out to the rest of the world. While we call it the Silk Road, Chinese people called it the Jade Road. We call it the Silk Road because we get silk from it. Chinese called it the Jade Road because jade came to them over this road. And this gate was the main route of the Silk Road for many centuries. And things to the west of this were considered the western regions. Now this map shows different ways that trade was carried out in ancient times, and the red one in the middle is the one we're interested in. It's the overland silk route that went through the western regions. If you look at that loop in the middle, that's the smaller area that China referred to as the western regions, when we're using it in a very specific way. This is an area that was mostly desert, and there are scattered oases in it. Some of the oases are quite small. Some of them are very large and had hundreds of thousands of people living in them. These are the path over which Buddhism came to China. Just one more map. I included this one because it shows some of the towns, and we'll be talking about some of those today. You can see that loop again around the Taklamakan Desert. Dunhuang is at the eastern side of that loop. It's near the Jade Gate. It's very famous for its Buddhist frescoes in the nearby Magao caves. And it was the center of a translation school, and a number of scribes lived there and translated Buddhist manuscripts. I made copies of them to be sent to Buddhists in China. Taklamakan is the name of that desert, and the more popular translation of it is, if you get in, you'll never get out. It's the second biggest shifting sand desert in the world. What that means is that it's covered with sands that keep moving. Very difficult to walk on. You can't grow food there. Animals can't find food there either for the most part. It's a very barren region. It's surrounded by deserts, like the Kunlun, the Pamirs, and the Tian Shan. So the only way for trade to get through this area was to go into the desert and make that loop along the edges where there was occasionally water and occasionally towns. On the edge of it, there's a place called the Turpan Depression, which is one of the lowest spots on Earth. It's also one of the driest because there's less rainfall than there is evaporation. So no matter how much it rains, there's never any water built up in the ground because it evaporates so quickly. So to get through this dry wasteland, people had to travel in groups on camels. It's almost unheard of for an individual to get through there alive. People have to go in a group and stick together. Otherwise, they can't make it. So just to give you a picture of what this desert looks like. That is a little bit of water. That dark brown area in the middle, that's water. There's a tiny patch of green around it, and surrounding it are the shifting sands and the rocks. And even this tiny little bit of water is an amazing thing to find in the desert. There's actually a monastery at this site. And it's in between two of the major oases in the western regions. Now, while some of the oases are like this, very tiny things, some of them are more like this, quite large. They can become large because they happen to find one of the nice spots where there is land that is able to grow food. These areas with water, place to grow food, and trade routes going through that were carrying lots of goods were able to develop great wealth, and they became centers of learning and a place where people from the east could meet the west, and the north and the south could all come together. So they were very rich areas intellectually, and many different religions flourished in this area. This is another fresco from this area, and it shows some of the different ethnic groups that lived in the region. In the greater western regions, they had these deserts, but they also had steppes that surrounded the mountains and deserts. And the steppes in particular had many nomadic peoples who lived in them. Now, I've been talking about urban and nomad. When I say urban, I don't necessarily mean a huge place like downtown St. Louis. I simply mean people who were settled and their lives were focused around a town. A town, a city, a neighborhood. Their political and economic structures are centered on the town. And they're the kind of thing that we usually study when we study history. We learn about town history. We don't usually learn about the history of nomads. When we study towns, we learn about classes of people. We learn about kings and soldiers and merchants, craftsmen and peasants. But in this part of the world, there's some other people who don't have all those classifications. Many of the steppe people are tribal nomads. They have a very different lifestyle, and they have a different way of looking at the world. This picture can give you some idea of how vast the distances are. People can travel for days without seeing a town, or without seeing someone who's in their own tribe traveling with them. I think you're all familiar probably with what urban cultures are like. So I'm going to focus on talking about the nomadic people. They're all herders. They all have animals to take care of. And they band together. They have to protect their animals. They have to take care of them. While someone in a town might have one shiny camel parked outside his house, in the desert and in the steppes, people have large herds of them. And they have to take care of all of them. So shepherds, of course, refer to people who herd sheep. But in this part of the world, people might also be herding camels or goats, horses or cattle, depending on the local conditions. But in each case, they have traditions of taking care of their animals, looking after them carefully, making sure they survive in these harsh conditions. And they're nomadic because the animals have to go where the food is. Whenever the animals need to move, the people move with them. They're dependent on them and they take care of each other. They're also organized into tribes. Now, in America, when we think of tribes, we usually think about Cherokee or Sioux, or maybe you think about people with weapons coming to attack a town, like the Mongol hordes or Attila the Hun. Most of the tribes are not attacking anybody. Tribes are made up of people living together in harsh conditions. Unlike urban people, the tribal people base their identity on their group rather than on the place where they lived. You can see a remnant of this idea in Scotland, which also used to have a tribal society. While they settled down, they maintained some of their tribal ways. And if you listen to the long list of titles that the Queen of England has, one of them is Queen of Scots. She's Queen of England, but she's Queen of Scots. Because the ruler of Scotland wasn't the ruler of a land, he was the ruler of a people. The people picked the ruler, he came from among them, and he ruled the people. Wherever the people went, the ruler would go with him, just as a shepherd would go with his flocks. It's a very different way of looking at the world, in that he's the leader of a people, not a person who owns some kingdom and is allowing the peasants and the other people to live there by his grace. So they have a very communal way of looking at things. Now, I'll have to get into some really dry stuff. I want to just mention a few of the nomadic peoples and kingdoms that would have been in the area, because when some of the other talks are given later in the year, they might mention some of these places. One of them is the Parthian Empire. And I included this map that shows it changing so you can see how these empires change over time. We like to think of borders as very solid and regular in modern times, but they weren't back then. Borders were constantly changing. Parthians came into this area, and they met up with what was called the Indo-Greek civilization that had developed in it. Indians bringing Buddhism had traveled north and northwest into what's now Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they had met up with Greek people who were living there, who had come with Alexander the Great and in other migration movements, and they formed a new civilization there. And one of the main areas they settled was called Gandhara, and it was a center of Buddhist development. And these are some of the first Buddhists to go to China as well. Parthians came from further north in Central Asia, and they maintained their ties to that area, and they traded on the Silk Road. So China had ties with this empire. Ambassadors went between the two of them. People back in this period were much more mobile than we often think they were. Chinese even sent ambassadors as far away as Rome. They were aware of Rome and had contact with them. So some of the famous Buddhist Parthians you may hear about later this year include An Shagao. He was a prince of the Parthians. He was one of the first translators to go to China and translate texts into Chinese. He had an assistant named An Swan, who was a merchant and a layman, who also translated a Mahayana text alongside An Shagao. And there were other monks, less well known today, but famous in their time, like Tanti and Fajin. The Parthians were bringing Buddhism to China from about 150 AD to about the 3rd century. The main successor was the Kushan Empire. They started around 30 before the Common Era, and their empire didn't fall apart until about 375 AD. They have a really complex history. Their ancestors lived to the north of China, where the Chinese knew them as the Yuezhi. The Kushan left and moved on to this area. They conquered Gandhara and much of India. And they helped to spread Buddhism through these areas too. You'll notice on the map that the green area goes all the way to the Jade Gate. On the border of China. Gandhara had its golden age in this period. And there are many famous Buddhists you may have heard of without knowing they were Kushans, like the Emperor Kanishka, who convened the Third Buddhist Council in Kashmir. Another famous Kushan Buddhist was Lokakshima. Venerable Lokakshima went to China and was one of the primary translators of Buddhist texts in China in this early period. Chinese monk Faxian, who you'll hear about later in the year, visited these regions after the empire had fallen apart and wrote of some of the conditions and how some areas seem to be in a decline. By the time Xianxing came from China to this area in the 7th century, the empires had broken up and there were local kings ruling the area. The golden era here had been ended by invaders. People usually assume they're Muslim, but the most destructive ones weren't Muslim. There were people like the Hephthalites and the Turks, who for the most part were pagan or animist. And they're responsible for most of the destruction of the monasteries and the towns. They seem to have been fighting Buddhist kingdoms for a long time and had developed a dislike of them. I'll just quickly go over some of the Buddhists of the Silk Road oases. One of the main ones is Kucha. These Silk Road oases are in the desert I talked about earlier, the Taklamakan Desert and the Turin Basin. Kucha is in the north of the desert, and it was known as the center of the Sarvastivadin school. It was a large kingdom which had many, many residents. Even in its decline in the 18th and 19th century, more than 60,000 people lived here. So in the period when it was Buddhist and in its golden age, more than 10,000 monks lived here, and there were hundreds of thousands of other citizens living here. This photo is of Bezeklik, the Thousand Buddha Caves, which was a monastic complex between Kucha and the oasis of Chopin. Well, you've never heard of Kucha, probably. There are also some famous Buddhists from here. Kumarajiva, one of the main translators of texts in China, was from Kucha. His mother was a princess there. He began as a Sarvastivadin in the schools there, but later became a proponent of the Mahayana. There were many other monks who came from here and went to China, including Po Yen, who resided at the White Horse Temple in China, and a number of other translators you probably haven't heard of, like Po Srimitra. Khotan is another oasis on the southern edge of the desert, and this one was a Mahayana center. It had thousands of monks as well, and hundreds of thousands of citizens. So when we talk about Buddhism on the Silk Road, we're talking about the Buddhism that went to China. It's As you have mentioned, Sarastivadins, who were probably what would have been called Hinayana at the time. We've also talked about Mahayanas. There are many different schools of Buddhism at this time, and you can find most of them on the Silk Road. Mahasanghika, Sarastivadins, Saviravadins, and Dharmaguptas. They could all be found there. They all brought sutras, they all brought teachings, and they all established monasteries along the way. This is what helped China to be able to preserve a huge amount of Buddhist material from a variety of schools, so that people in China were able to study the whole of Buddhism and develop some understandings of it that may have been different from what some other places may have had. For instance, the Tiantai school developed especially the idea of one Dharma. All Dharmas are one Dharma. This is possible because they were able to see so many different practices, the teachings of the Dharma that came to China over the Silk Road. You'll notice this statue, which is of a Buddhist man sitting in dhyana, or meditation. And he looks rather different from some of the other statues you may have seen. That's because anywhere Buddhism has gone in the past, when people make statues of the Buddha or of their own monks, they look like the local people. Sometimes they try to draw pictures or make statues of Buddhists in India, but most of the statues look like the local people. And this statue is of a Kushan, and he's dressed like a Kushan would be, not like maybe a Chinese monk would be a few centuries later. This is because wherever Buddhism went, it had to be used by the local people. They were not bringing in something that was foreign and trying to force it into their own culture. Buddhism is adaptable in that way. As long as they preserved the core of the teaching, it could fit very well into a local culture. This goes right back to the origins of Buddhism. Because when you look at the Buddhist teachings, he teaches to each audience as each audience needs to hear things. When he's talking to families, he talks about family issues and what it's like to live in a family. When he talks to merchants, he talks about the kind of troubles that merchants might have and how to deal with them. When a very scholarly Brahmin came to him, he could talk to him in a very scholarly way. This is one of the points of a Buddhist teacher. You're supposed to be able to teach appropriately to the audience. So when Buddhism went to places like Gandhara and the surrounding areas, where there were many people who, say, came from a Greek background, you'll see that their art incorporates bodhisattvas who look much like Hercules or Atlas, because those were the heroes they knew who helped people. Atlas holding up the world on his shoulders, carrying the weight so everyone else could be safe in the world and the world would not fall apart. He's often depicted in the Indo-Greek Buddhist art from this area. He's at the bottom, holding up the Buddha on his lotus throne. There's Atlas underneath, pulling everything up, along with all the other bodhisattvas that are around the Buddha. We also see this because Buddhism teaches that we should not become too attached to rites and rituals. It's one of the reasons why you see the robes change somewhat as you go around Asia. They don't look quite the same everywhere. When people went to colder places, they had to have robes with sleeves, high collars, because that was what the local people wore and what they needed to stay warm. You couldn't have walked around with bare shoulders in medieval China. You would have scandalized everyone. When you look at the tribal peoples in these areas, they seem to have especially liked the Mahayana teachings. While you can sometimes see some of the other schools in the towns, many of the tribal people seem to have been more drawn to Mahayana, which you still see in their descendants today, like the Tibetans and the Mongolians. They're overwhelmingly Mahayana. Does this mean that Mahayana is better than other schools? No. It means that it's the best one for them, maybe. They have a focus on that because it fits into their culture better and fits into the way that they view the world. People had to deal with as Buddhism traveled through Central Asia and they saw these different schools. They had to consider, is this Buddhist? It looks very different from that other Buddhist who came through town last year. How do we know they're all Buddhist? So this is from Shantideva, quoting the Shiksa Samataya. And this was developed in the Abhidharma, which is an analysis of the Dharma, derived from the sutras. So how do we know that it's Dharma? How do we know that this is a Buddhist teaching or a Buddhist practice? Well, it's connected with the truth. Now, it's the greatest truth in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths. So if it's true according to that, then it's probably true. It's connected with the Dharma. The Dharma is always marked by the Dharma seals. Impermanence, no self, suffering, and Nibbana. It has to lead to giving up defilement, not to increasing your defilement. So if it's making you worse, and you're doing it the way you're supposed to, it's probably not really a Buddhist practice. And it points out the praiseworthy qualities of Nibbana, not samsara. So if some teaching is telling you that you know you're a good person if you have a Rolls Royce, that's probably not a Buddhist teaching. So in China, when they received all these teachings, they could look at them with these kinds of concepts and know that they're all the Dharma. That led them to understand the concept of all Dharmas are one Dharma. That's also an idea that goes back to early Buddhism. It's one of the tenets of the Mahasanghika, which are one of the first two schools in Buddhism. I'll skip that for now. I'll come back to one of the reasons, I think, why the tribalists were so taken with the Mahayana and with the Bodhisattva practices. One of the metaphors for the Bodhisattva is the Bodhisattva as a shepherd, someone who does not leave anyone behind in samsara, We all cross over to enlightenment together. No one is really alone. We all exist together. Of course, this ties right in with their own culture, which is based on shepherding, looking out for the other members of your tribe. People who live in a place where you can't live alone and you have to be dependent upon others are very likely to accept this and be able to see this as truth pretty easily, because it fits with what they know already. So it's a good way to teach to them and to bring the Dharma to them. Of course, this arises from the earliest teachings. Because we exist interdependently. Nobody exists alone. One hand doesn't clap by itself, you need two hands. So Bodhisattva practices their recognition of this, that we're all interdependent, existing together, that we make samsara together, and that we can go to awakening together too. And out of compassion, we won't leave anybody behind. It's easier to make that leap if you already live in a society in which you feel like you have to take care of other people. So for the tribal peoples in the western regions, all they had to do was make that leap of not just restraining their compassion and their togetherness to their tribe, but expanding it to people in general. So it was not too much of a leap for some of them. So it was really difficult to make this talk, to try to get all this out. It's so very dry. But I think it can help us to understand that there are all these different practices of Dharma for a reason. Everyone has their own karma. Everyone has their own way of looking at the world. We're all human, but we all have different ways of seeing things, interpreting things. And we all have our own karma to work through. So a practice and a teaching that might really resonate with me might not resonate with the person sitting next to me so well. He or she may need something a little different. It doesn't mean it's not Dharma. It's just that there's some of the 84,000 paths of the Dharma for all the different people that are in the world. I think that's one of the really beautiful things about Buddhism, is you can't bring everyone to enlightenment unless you have enlightenment for everybody, right? You have to have the practices for everybody, you have to have the teachings for everyone. And they need to be able to reach everyone, no matter who they are. So, may all beings know happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings know the great altruistic joy that is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the equanimity that is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance.